You've taught many courses that'll touch on a lot of what we're going to talk about. And I remember having sat through your philosophy course, we would take the first half of the class and it would be really the history of philosophy.
Mm.
We would start back with the early Greek thinkers and make our way up to the modern period. Schaeffer, he starts off, and I wanted to get your insights on this to kind of track where we're at today. And I think it does help people to understand we didn't just parachute in out of the
Mm.
sky into where we are today. There has been a progression of thought that has taken place, and a progression of ideas. Maybe I should say a regression of
Mm.
ideas that got us to where we are today. And what Schaeffer picks up on in this first chapter, he mentions three really key ideas or movements. The first that he talks about is the particular and the universal.
Mm.
We know if we go back to Plato, Plato believed in the universals, what he called the forms. He really believed there was a non-physical reality, if you like, that stood behind the physical, that stood behind the particulars, that gave them the form that they have, an ordering behind the reality that we can see with our eyes. Schaeffer mentions how, as we move into the modern period, we lose that. We
Mm.
lose the belief in the universal. We'll increasingly kick God more and more out of the picture so that we not only begin with the particulars, but that's all we have left at some point.
Mm.
Can you help make a little sense of that phenomenon and how where we are today with that in a way that people can get their heads
Mm.
around?
Well, I don't know if they'll get their heads around it, but um, yeah, of course, this was the big question of philosophy from the very beginning, and that is, the one and the many, the universals and the particulars. And you're right, we have people like Plato and then Aristotle, and that pretty much carried the day. Aristotelian thinking was very much, as you know, by Thomas Aquinas. Uh, uh, he Thomas was an Aristotelian, so much of the classic theology recognized the universal and the particulars. Later
Mm.
in this book, the Church at the End of the 20th Century talks about form and freedom,
Yes.
and the form was the universal, and freedom was because this what pertained to the particulars, but the freedom was only if there was going to be form.
Yeah.
And so when you lost the universals, that is the thing that tied everything together, yes, it gave meaning because it connected everything. And this was the first question that Aristotle would ask: what is it? We ask, what can it do? Aristotle would say, well, what is it?
Yeah.
Believing that its nature, that being the universal, for example, the particular of man, man is a particular, but he is organized according to his essence or the universal or humanness. And when you lose that, of course, when that gets drained off, then all that's left is the particular. Now, the particular is only gets significance as it's related to another particular.
Mm.
Whereas early on, the particular got its importance, its meaning, its purpose, because it was connected to the universal. And that we could say the universal being humanity, but over that, of course, was God.
Yeah.
When you lose that, all you have left is particulars. So you can see how, I mean, I won't go into all of that, but you can see how materialism becomes entrenched because all you have are particulars.
Yeah.
So now the purpose in life is to accumulate as many particulars as you can. Well, that breeds materialism. And if there is no universal, of course, there is no God. If there is
Yes.
nothing above experience, you think about marriages. Without the universal in the picture, man's meaning, his significance was to another human being. another particular. And it was, so then I get my meaning from having this other particular in my life. And when that other being does not serve my purposes, whatever, I just give it up and I go to find something else. So
Yeah.
I think I probably kind of dance around the question that you've asked me. But I would say universals and particulars are just one of the key issues that starts very early. It's one of the first questions that comes up,
Yeah.
like with Heraclitus. Um, and it is Plato who tries to solve the question. It is Christianity. And we see it in Augustine. Augustine was a Platonist. And so what Augustine did, and then many of those that followed, what we would say, they Christianized Plato. It wasn't Platonizing Christianity.
Right.
It was the other way around. They were too smart. They would not have bought into all that Plato because they believed that creation was not bad. There was
Right.
evil in it, but it itself was not bad. So they broke away from Plato. But Plato had the right understanding of this relationship between the universal and the particular and came very close, I might say. And I think
Yeah.
that's a testimony to the power of natural revelation.
Yes.
That
Many people have suspected, did Plato read Moses? Because he gets close in some areas. But yeah, he'll write about justice. And he's talking about the universal. And he'll describe different just acts,
Yeah.
but they all participate in the universal justice.
That's
So he'll
correct.
do the same thing with friendship. Friendship being the universal and different expressions of that. He's always after, in these shorter works that he writes, the universal. What is the thing, the essence of the thing, the form of it? Yeah, you made a good point. You said when we lose the universal, all we have left is our relationship to other particulars,
Mhm.
and we can't find our significance or our meaning any longer with reference to, let's just say, to God. If God is kicked out of the picture, as he largely is in
Mhm.
our present day today, at least in the Western world,
Yeah.
then we're trying to find in all sorts of foolish and frustrating ways our significance in relation to other particulars. And I can't help but think about Marxism as an attempt to do that. And it seems to be coming back to us again, this attempt to sort of push Marxism under a different name back into society again. But that idea was that you look at your neighbor and you ask the question, how much material stuff does he have?
Mhm.
And why does he have more material stuff than I have? And we try to sort significance out and meaning on the basis of how much stuff each person is allowed to have. Because there was no way to answer the question, who am I and what am I, with a relation to God any longer. Marx didn't want anything to do with that. And that's just one example. But I see that is really what so many people today are struggling with in the culture, is they don't know, they can't answer the question, who am I? What does it mean to be a human being with relation to the universal any longer? And Schaeffer, he points to the loss of the universal just to show one of the steps in this progression of thought that's led to the modern period. The other that he picks up on that really kind of follows along this track is, I think he calls it modern science.
Mhm.
Schaeffer has all these interesting
Yeah.
ways of naming things. But the idea was that with modern science, we recognize the uniformity in nature, the uniformity of natural laws, or let's just say the uniformity within creation. We recognize that. You could think back to Bacon, Newton, these thinkers who would recognize these sorts of things, and they didn't therefore conclude we don't need God. They, I think, especially with Newton, his impulse was to worship when he recognized the uniformity of nature's laws. But that, when Schaeffer says modern science, there comes a turn at some point to where we added the little phrase on the end of that, the uniformity of nature in a closed system. And that's what Schaeffer picks up on, in a closed system where, again, God is kicked out of the picture of science. Science can now explain the uniformity in the world, but we increasingly start to think about, rather than a created order, we start to think about creation like a machine.
Mm.
And Schaeffer says at some point, too, that this wraps its arms around man and we become part of that machine. And you get studies like sociology, where now man becomes one of the subjects that we study within the machine. Do you want to say anything about that movement that Schaeffer picks up on as well? Because it seems like I could see how that would be very much connected to a loss of the universal and how we get further off the path of truth.
Yes, as you were talking, I'm thinking about, man becomes the machine. And so we see now what's going on with AI.
Mm.
When this is now going to go to its logical conclusion, and the machine is now above man, transhumanity, humanness, as we talk about it. This is only what is left. And I think that Richard Weaver makes it so clear in his little book, Ideas and Consequences, where he says in the introduction that if you deny that there are any universals, if you deny there's anything above experience, he said all you were left with is experience. And in that case, man becomes the measure of all things. But because man, of course, man is a broken being, so he's a very poor standard to which to seek perfection in and to make sense of a world. If that's all you're left with, and evolution is working behind this. So the big thing that comes out all of this, I think, Brian, is the one thing that now becomes sort of the not the God, maybe it is almost like a God, is the idea of progress. That just as creation of the nature has progressed to this point, we are going to have to progress. So everything from about the 17th, late 1700s, everything now is progress. We're going to do this by ourselves because that's all we have now. So no one bothered to consider the first assumption, that is that God is not there. That is, God still remains in the conversation, but he is not there as a part of true reality.
Yeah.
He is just simply there because he's in the vocabulary. Now, eventually, that's even going to drop out as where we are today. So for a long time, people talked about God, but it was a God pretty much of their own making. It wasn't that this was a God as a part of true reality. So you'd have to factor God in as to what you were doing. Well, of course, from all of this, morals collapse, ethics collapse, and naturalism takes over. And that's where I think that's where we're left today, is sheer naturalism, even for Christians, and this whole idea of progress. Listen, we talk about progressives, even the church. This is what you get out of the Enlightenment. Roughly, people with the date on it, 1688. I don't know if we can be that particular. But the idea is that new is always superior to the past. And the only means of knowledge gaining is through rationalism. So revelation is out. So man's really left on his own. So this, by time, naturalism, yes, I say that's all that's left. Now, intellectually, Christians never accepted naturalism. They were too smart for that. They knew that naturalism was contrary to Christianity. because Christianity is a supernatural way of looking at life. But they were taken in by practice. And we began to adopt the things because progress was so important to us. What can give us progress? How can we, as we hear this expression so foreign to me, we're going to grow our church?
Mm.
Read Paul and see what he talks about. Well, Paul says, I'm going to Galatia, I'm going to grow my church. That is such new language, but it's all part of this idea of progress. We are now on a better path than the ancients were. Now, as I say, Christians would never have given up intellectually the idea of supernaturalism, but practically, if I could be so bold to say, many of them operate existentially as naturalists.
I'm just looking here. Schaeffer goes on after that to talk about he calls it cosmic alienation, where humanity feels totally alienated from their world. There's a longing that we don't seem to be able to entirely snuff out and get rid of for God. And you remember Nietzsche's line that you used to quote in one of your courses, where he longed in the end to come back to, he mentioned the metaphysical. And I think he mentioned perhaps he got a whiff of that in the arts through music or something or another. But even Nietzsche, at the end of his life, who concludes that there is no meaning. I mean, at least Nietzsche was pretty consistent with what he was trying to say. If God's not there, we don't have anywhere to find freedom.
Yeah, form and freedom, I think I've used this illustration before. I only have a few, so I have to use them for everything. A train is only free when it's on the form of the track. Take the train off the track and make it totally free, it's useless.
Yes.
And I think that time we mentioned this, it's like fire. Fire is a wonderful thing, as long as it's within the stove.
Yes.
But we don't just let it go everywhere, because then it becomes very destructive. And this is what, of course, the 60s demonstrated. So many of the people who, which is so well illustrated in Dead Poet Society.
Yes.
What ended up happening is that many of the people who argued for all of this, as soon as the fun was over, the gloss was off, they all went back to a very normal kind of life, living in suburbia, and enjoying life. Now, as you said, we've come to another time, but our time is somewhat different. And today, it's freedom, but it's not talked about as freedom. Today, the big word is my rights.
My rights. Yep. Yeah. With no way to ground any of that. Right. No way to ground any of that by the people that talk about it. And yeah. I want to read a quote here from Schaeffer, because I read this and I thought it sounds like Schaeffer's commenting on our news today. Mm-hmm. But he's talking about the student revolution of the 60s. Mm-hmm. And of course, he was mentioning how the faculty in the university systems were the ones that were teaching students to deny the universal.
Yes.
And this was all well and good as long as they lived that out in a way that didn't disrupt the faculty. And I just think about what we're seeing on university campuses today, and it really is sad. You have these students who, you and I know, if you went and polled 100 of them and asked them to describe what really bothers them about Israel, they probably couldn't even explain what in the world's going on in Israel right now, but they're showing up with signs and building, setting up tents and trashing university campuses, crying out for their hatred of Israel. And Schaeffer writes this. He says, of the 1960s student revolution, he says, so the faculty screamed with glee when the students stormed the administrative offices, but they squealed once they turned against the faculty. They had cut away their own foundations, and they had no categories with which to say what is right and what is wrong. They had no way to stop the flood they had loosed. Yeah, I know he mentions here somewhere the idea of you had the middle class people who, although they had been hoodwinked largely by naturalism, they take the middle class people who were not necessarily professing Christians, but they had a memory of the traditional morality that they liked. And they saw that if you went away from that and you started going in the progressive direction, this will lead to the disintegration of society. So they wanted very much what the Christians wanted in terms of the lived out and affirmed morality, but they had no way to ground it. It was just in a memory. And I don't remember the metaphor he uses, but one that's always helped me with this is if if you lose the universal, the memory of so much of what you had with that will linger on for some time, but you give it enough time and you're going to lose that. I've thought about a conductor of an orchestra who's conducting the music. And if he stepped off the platform, it wouldn't go into total disarray in 5-10 seconds. But you give it 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 minutes, even these professional musicians in time without a reference point that they're all aiming at, a fixed reference point, eventually it's not going to be music anymore. It's just going to be chaos.
I've often used the illustration, whether it's good or bad, not to up your illustration, which is good, to use the illustration of the lines in a parking lot. So when we go to the mall, if you do, or any parking lot, you know where to park because there are lines there that tell you where to park.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like the early ideas of Christianity, the Christian consensus. We knew what morality was because we had these lines that would detail for us in the scriptures. Now,
Yes.
if it should happen that overnight somebody blacks out all the lines in the parking lot, the people who have a memory of the lines will still try to park as if there were the lines.
Yes.
But people who had no concept of lines in a parking lot will do what? They'll park as close to the door as they possibly can. They'll become selfish. And that's pretty much, I think, what we see in our own society. We
Yeah.
have a fading number of people who remember the lines, so to speak, the
Yes.
moral lines. We have a growing group of people who have no memory of the lines whatsoever. So how do they live their lives? The same way they park at the mall, as close to the door as they possibly can. Now, notice what happens. Now notice here we have this form in freedom. I park in the line, right? So when I leave the mall, I can get out of the parking lot again because everybody else is parked in the lots. But now take the people who don't have any memory of the lines. They park as close to the door as they can. Well, that's okay, great. You're the first one there and you get very close to the door. But you're in the mall shopping and now you come out and 100 other people have come and they've parked close to the door they can. Now, what's happened to your freedom? Your freedom is lost because you are now parked in by 50 other cars. So the advantage of the form, it protects the freedom. It's not that God has tried to take away our fun. He's really tried to protect it. And so when we lose the universal, which is we started out talking, you see what chaos comes. We see that now on our college campuses. Now, what has been placed in its place is something that's quite fuzzy, and that is rights. Now, you remember that Solzhenitsyn, speaking to Harvard, talked about the fact we breathe with two lungs, rights and responsibilities. Responsibilities come to live responsibly within the lines.
Yes.
And my rights are only applicable to the degree that I'm willing to park within the lines.
Yeah.
But now the universal is gone, and all we have is this nebulous concept of rights. Who demands what the rights are? I tell you what my rights are. I have got a right. I've got a right to say that if I just do this one thing, I just was listening to a podcast, and there is something in the criminal code which says, okay, that if an illegal alien votes in an election in America, as long as he believes at the time that he is a citizen, there can be no criminal charges brought against him. Now, I trust that. I mean, the person documented that, told where that would be found. It's way down in the fine print. But
Yeah,
see,
yeah.
this is the whole thing. I get to define it myself.
Yes. That analogy, I'm going to concede that I like your analogy better than mine.
You don't have to.
No, it's very helpful. I think that helps people to go back to this idea of we're not just sitting up in an ivory tower thinking abstract thoughts because we've not got anything better to do with our time. When we talk about universals and particulars, this is the stuff of life. And to show people that this analogy is what you've got with society today. The lines have been blacked over in our modern day society. This is why a man does not know what it means to be a man or a woman anymore. And we think we can just black the lines out. And if I feel this way, I'll claim this. If I feel that way, parents allowing children to have operations. They're not even allowed to go vote, but they can choose to go have an operation. Anyway, we could describe this in all sorts of ways, but this is the why behind what we're seeing is the loss of the universal, and you can park anywhere and do whatever you want with selfish motives. Schaeffer, this leads right into Schaeffer talks about not only co-belligerent concept versus allies, but maybe even more helpful. He says there must be by the church the preaching and the practice of truth. The preaching and the practice of truth. So remember earlier when we were talking about living as naturalists, functionally as Christians, even though we'd never sign off on the doctrine. We're not that dumb. But we market, we try to manipulate. Look at even our educational system, even our Christian colleges or seminaries, and how much we try to sell an experience to somebody who's going to come and have a fun experience, as a young person. You think, why not highlight the truth that they're going to get when they come? Why not make that the emphasis and the sole emphasis, the truth, and maybe the community that they would get in a Christian context? And Schaeffer mentions both just as the church. We have to be preaching the truth and practicing the truth. And I thought, Dr. Little, that because the lines have been blacked over, you have to, would you agree that you have to almost take a step back in preaching and help people see where the lines used to be and the fact that we need to get them back? You can't assume they're there anymore, even when you're preaching to Christians.
Absolutely. And this is where I think the failure has come, is that we have magnified this idea of what's your life verse, as if the Bible, that we get our instruction from one verse. And Schaeffer will say, no, it's the whole thing. You've got to see the integration. You can't just see this verse over here by itself. You've got to see it in the whole context. And I think to start back to re-educate people, I'm talking about Christians, is to go back to the book of Genesis.
Yes, and to show the foundations
That's
of
exactly
everything that we're building on. We used to be able to assume that
yes.
at some point in history, but at some point that's not there anymore.
No.
And we have to go back and help people think through what's been lost, why was it lost, here's where it is, in the very beginning of the Bible, the foundation for everything. But so he mentions the preaching of truth and the practice of truth. And it's that second part too that we have to be careful with, that we're not just preaching one thing and going and doing another. But I think that's exactly what's happening, even unintentionally at times, when we let naturalism come in. So if a pastor's preaching through the book of Genesis, but we've got really slick marketing and we're selling more of an experience of whatever it may be versus emphasizing the truth, haven't we just done unintentionally something like this. We've maybe preached truthfully, but not demonstrated it.
Yes, and if I should just say um, what I've been thinking is that, again, this form of naturalism is while we open the Bible and preach truth, we frame it in human psychology. The way we practice truth. Oh, this is how we've got a 12-step program, a 6-step program, whatever. No, it's framed, the application of it, the not the Spirit of God living within
Yeah.
and yielding my members as instruments of righteousness. That seems to be almost silent. How do you live the Christian life? Well, I've got a book for you. Here are 3 steps, 4 steps, whatever. This is how you can do what the Bible says. You know what I'm saying? That's naturalism. That's naturalism in spades.
Yeah. But it's so subtle that most people read a book like that and they think this is really helpful. This gives me something to do, something
Yeah,
I can quantify, you know,
that's right.
something I can put a number next to and know that I'm making progress. Right? It
Natural.
almost it really is, and we sound probably like stuffy people talking this way, but I just hope that people can see this for what it is, because if you can't quantify something, modern people, we don't even know how to value it. We don't know how to give a value to something that we can't put a number next to. So when I read in the New Testament, it's telling me that these certain qualities are to be ever increasing in my life. I'm not given a number grid to check this thing off by. There's supposed to be something about a sense of the Spirit of God in my life and closeness with Christ and virtue growing without the need to stick a number next to it.
You touch upon something that I just think is crucial to come to confront. And even when we talk about spiritual things, we somehow try to quantify so that we can know, am I being spiritual?
Yes.
And of course, spirituality is not quantifiable.
Right. Right.
It's not intended to be quantifiable.
Exactly. It's trying to tell how tall I am by stepping on a weight scale. That's not
Yeah,
that's not
that's
what that
right.
instrument
That,
does.
that's right. Yeah.